by way of very brief introduction, for those of you I don't know, my name is Leigh Schvartz. I look after cloud and service provider offerings at Fujitsu. So essentially what I do is look across what we have within Fujitsu to take out to market via our service provider partners. What we will go through today is we'll go through the research assets that we have created to support this research. We'll go through the findings, we'll take you through our conclusions and our recommendations, and then how to engage with us to help you implement some of these things and help. Should be about 30 minutes in total. There is a chat box. If anyone has any questions as we go through, please feel free to drop your questions in there. My colleague Sam is on the chat as well, so he can answer while we're presenting, and we can do some questions at the end, should there be any. So to begin with, this is the research asset. This will go out to everyone who registered for the webinar, and we'll communicate this out wider, and we'll be doing some press and some launch on this over the next couple of weeks. This essentially is the written version of what I'm going to go through today. So if you're listening into this, this will be somewhat repeated, but there is some more interesting deep dives in the report that might be interesting to you. So let's get straight into the research. So just by way of setting the scene, we had a research agency called Vanson Bourne conduct this research for us. They're a technology-specific market research agency. They do a lot of this kind of work, and we're very pleased with what they did. Just by definition, before we get into the research, we ask a lot of questions in this report about service providers, end customers' view of service providers, and it's important to note we did ask end customers in this research, not service providers themselves, and we'll get to that in a second. But throughout the report, we defined service provider as a regional focused UK cloud or managed service provider and excluded the global system integrators and consultancies. And the reason for this is we draw some conclusions and comparisons between how end customers use these type of providers as we go through the report and the survey and the results. So just an important distinction to make before we start. So wherever we're talking about service provider here, sometimes referred to as local service provider, this is really what we're looking at. So in terms of demographics, who we spoke to 200 UK IT decision makers, and these are people that had to be actively involved in their organization's decision of whether or not to use service providers for their IT. We did this over the summer. We split the responses and the respondents into various sizes, and we sort of did this deliberately so we could again draw some comparisons against the different sizes of organization. And there is some interesting comparisons, and we'll go through some of them as we go through the research results. Also, organizational sectors. Again, we kind of just wanted a good split to get a good subset of the market. So we have quite a lot of them here. In the report, we do look at some of the conclusions between different industries. I'm not going to dig into them too much today, purely for the reason that the sample sizes of different sector are quite small. But if anyone on the call focuses on these particular sectors or verticals and are interested in looking at some of the deep dive results, we would be more than happy to take you through them. Just let us know after the call. Okay, so 4 areas I'm going to cover as we go through the research. First of all, the strategic view from the end customer. So how do they work with service providers? Why? What kind of traits are they looking for? What are they looking for from future partners? Those kind of things. Predicting the future. So which offerings are going to be in demand today, in 3 years, and in 5 years? And we look across infrastructure and application services for that. So some really interesting results in there that we'll get to. We then have a section focused particularly on cloud, so local service provider clouds versus hyperscale provider clouds. We added this in really by request of a lot of the partners we're working with, especially those who have their own cloud service and are looking at how best to position that against, the hyperscale providers. So, and then finally, we're looking at future channel partner landscapes and how those of you on the call who are in the reselling business at the moment, is it too late to move into this area, or is it not? Just bear with me one moment while I thought I'd turn this off. Sorry about this. Okay, sorry about that. So first of all, the strategic view from the end customer. Before we get into exactly what partners are looking for from service providers, we wanted to ask a question on IT infrastructure ownership and where do they see their IT infrastructure being owned in 5 years' time. We looked at here, and we were very surprised by these results. So as you can see, the bulk is still going to be owned and hosted on premises. I imagine that will be very different if we ask that today, and we do look at some of that as we go through. But almost as high is owned and managed by a service provider and delivered as a managed service. So that shows to us that the use of service providers in IT infrastructure ownership is going to rise significantly. And the real surprise here for us was that the amount rented via a public cloud model was just under 25%, so quite a lot lower than owned and managed by service providers themselves. We did look at this in 5 years' time, so it would be interesting, and we have some results as we go through. I imagine if we asked that today, that would be quite different, and maybe even in 2 or 3 years, it would be quite different. But it seems, and the feedback we're hearing, we launched these research results to some of our partners in London a few weeks ago, and the trend we seem to see is that a lot of end customers were going headfirst into the public cloud and then actually asking service providers to augment that and add their own offerings on top, which is maybe why we get to this kind of picture as we go through. But very interesting. And I think if you're a service provider today or you're evolving your business to get into this area, these should be very encouraging results. And remember, UK specific here. We then asked the organizations, the end customers, who they would like to work with in order to achieve their IT goals. So first of all, on the left, we asked, is it important to work with local service providers as well as global SIs and consultancies? And again, we asked this because a lot of our partners were wondering, should they be competing with or partnering with these organizations? And it's very clear from the results that over 8 out of 10 customers think they need to work with local service providers as well as the global players. And we always hear the global players becoming more and more local. Local service providers, regional service providers, still very much in demand. We then asked the same question specifically around cloud offerings. So will you use a combination of cloud offerings from hyperscale providers and service providers in building your IT environment? And again, very strong, 8 out of 10 said yes, they are looking to use offerings from both players. And we will dig into some more detail as we go through. But again, very, very interesting results. We then looked at the types of partners they were working with today from a reseller and a service provider perspective. And today, on average, across the sample, respondents were working with 2 reseller partners and 3 service provider partners. Interesting in itself that service providers are already outnumbering the reseller partners, I thought was quite interesting. But then we also asked, what is your preference on working with these partners? And we didn't ask the questions in this order. This is just the narrative that came out of the research. That 87%, so almost 9 in 10 from the research, would rather limit the number of partners that their organization has so they can form more business-focused strategic relationships with the ones that they work with. So, I mean, these two things don't really add up. So we've got on one side end customers wanting to use a multitude of different offerings from different partners. They want to work with all the different partners that give them all different goodness. But at the same time, they want to limit the number of partners they're working with so they can be more business focused. So we have an issue here that needs to be solved. In terms of the answer to that, we look at this question here. So this is the proportion of IT estates due to be managed by service providers today, in 3 years, and in 5 years. So already fairly high now at just under 30%. We're seeing consistent growth in 3 and 5 years, so almost doubling actually in 5 years' time. So clearly end customers are expecting to increase their use of service providers to help with this challenge. And if we look at the reasons why they're using service providers, we can see here, I mean, the most striking thing here and one of the most encouraging is that reduced costs isn't actually number one. Often when we do these surveys, cost is always the number one driving factor, and in this case, it's not. And if you look at these top 5, all of the other 4 are focused on enabling the business to meet their digital goals or digitally transform. So the first one is using service providers to free up IT resources. Then we have reduced costs. Then we have delivering innovative solutions, getting outside expertise, and augmenting the skills within the business. So it's clear here that the service providers that they work with do need to be strategic because they are going to be very integral to helping the organization transform. We then also asked, will you be engaging with one of these service provider partners on a key digital initiative? And we define digital initiative as IoT or AI or something like this. And 9 out of 10 said yes. The top 3 here, by the way, I don't have a slide on it, but the top 3 are security and compliance was number 1, Internet of Things was number 2, and artificial intelligence was number 3. So the key digital things that the businesses want to work on, they're expecting to work with service providers to do it. So in terms of how that leads into what's expected of a future-ready service provider, so what do these partners need to be able to do, and what do you need to be able to do to engage with your customers in the future to help them on this journey? So, well, number 1, I think is fairly obvious from the results, be integral to delivering the organization's digital transformation. This comes down to less partners that are more strategic. 85% are looking for consulting on their current IT estate, and then personalized offerings, so being more flexible. This rings true with what we see from our current partners, the discussion we had in London a few weeks ago, as well as what we see in the market, that more advisory and consultative functions are in demand by end customers. And then having a service provider who's flexible enough to take their offerings and fit them into exactly what that customer needs. And then slightly less, but still very high, 81%, is that those service providers be capable of working directly with business leaders. So having a business-focused lens as well as a technology-focused lens. And critical for us, and I think one of the major takeaways from this research is that 92% expect their service providers to integrate services together, both their own and third parties, to deliver improved business outcomes. So if we look at the challenge that was presented on the first few slides of end customers want all the offerings from all of the partners, but they want to take them from some strategic focused, a small subset of partners. This is the answer to that. So they're looking to service providers who are able to integrate services together for them in the background to deliver on that business outcome. So using consultancy, using advisory, understanding the customer's business, and then looking at what's in the market to be able to put a solution together which fits that need. And we'll come on to this in a bit more detail when we get to the conclusions, but that comes down to you as service providers having an ecosystem of micro alliances that you can call upon when you need to take the best of what's in the market to do this work, so service integration type work. So that's what they're looking for in terms of partners. What are they looking for in terms of offerings? So what's coming in the future? This is a bit of a busy slide, and there's a lot of different narratives on here, but let's try and go from left to right and then take away some of the outcomes. So at the moment you can see in the green is the offerings that are being used today. So this is offerings that end customers were using service providers for today. On-prem infrastructure managed services, I think unsurprisingly is the biggest, but that is facing some decline. It's not going away. It's still going to be a quarter in 5 years. It's still very significant, but not as significant as it is now. Private hosted infrastructure managed services, so hosted on service provider premise, is growing in 3 years and then declining a little bit, but still a bit more than on premises. Again, still very significant. Public cloud managed services from a single cloud provider, we think this one was quite interesting. So that's an end customer using a service provider purely for their, say, Microsoft Azure or service provider own cloud offering. That's staying fairly flat and then declining a little bit. And where we see the growth here is service providers who are able to provide public cloud orchestration and managed services across multiple clouds. Could be your own cloud, it could be Azure, Amazon, etc. But being able to front end, and it comes back to this service integration message, but being able to front end that to the customer to deliver them the best thing for exactly what they're doing in the business. But we can see across these 4, all of these are in demand in 5 years. So it's important to have a good subset of offerings and a good alliance network that you can call upon should you not do all of these things yourselves. Briefly on the others, disaster recovery and storage as a service, still fairly consistent and still going to be in demand, especially as we get more and more public cloud and disaster recovery and backup becomes more important. Desktop as a service has some strong growth. We're going to touch on that one next. And infrastructure as a service with no managed services is still relatively important, going up and then declining very slightly. Potentially one of the most interesting things on this slide on the far right is migration away from the public cloud. So if we take this in context of the question, that's end customers predicting almost doubling, so predicting themselves that they will need a partner to help them migrate away from the public cloud in 5 years. The fact that they're predicting an almost doubling of that requirement is, I think, quite interesting in itself. But take from that what you will. Let's look at desktop as a service in a little bit more detail. So, because that was one of the strongest growth areas. So this is the percentage of users in an organization using a desktop as a service or DaaS model. And desktop as a service, just to be clear here, is defined as a desktop in a cloud type service. Nothing to do with the device. This is the virtual desktop. So 15% now, 28%, 41%. So fairly strong growth in terms of the number of users who are using a DaaS type model. And if you look at the result, the types of roles within those organizations who are using this type of model, it's fairly even now. So IT a little bit ahead. You've then got customer service, sales, operations, and marketing all relatively close. 6, 7, and 8 in this survey as well were all above 35%. So you can see that there isn't a really clear only this organizational role fits DaaS. It seems to be fairly consistent across the business. And if we look at potentially why this is spiking so much, one of the things we looked at was, are organizations using this to overcome the Windows 7 end of support deadline? 64% said yes. That rises to 72% when you look at organizations of less than 1,000. And if you look at our smaller organizations, this rises to 86%. So the takeaway here is that desktop as a service for smaller and medium enterprises and large as well, but particularly those smaller medium enterprises is going to be critical in the future as they look to be more flexible with their IT requirements and maybe allowing their users to use more of a bring your own device type style. Okay, so let's briefly also look at application and data services. So if the conclusion from infrastructure services is that things are moving towards more hybrid, they're already hybrid today, but they're moving even more so to be more of an even split. I think the takeaway from application services is that these are already in the cloud and customers expect software as a service type models today. So if we look at the type of offerings they're looking for from service providers, today the most popular and increasingly more popular is managed services around those public software as a service offerings. So we had an example here of Office 365 managed services. So transition and then additional services around Office 365 is the number one and continues to be the number one. Private hosted application services is declining over the next 5 years, really in favor of these software as a service type models. On-prem application managed services has a slight rise and then declines, probably as organizations look to change their on-prem application strategies, again, looking to their software vendors more and more for software as a service type models. Private hosted software as a service with no managed services, so just private instances of, say, SAP from your own data centers. It has a fairly big spike in 3 years, interestingly, probably as they look for secure ways of consuming software as a service, if they're a little bit more reluctant to move to public cloud models, but that sort of levels off in 5 years' time. Data analytics, fairly consistent, and backup as a service is always a safe bet here. So even rising, even more so as the software as a service models come on. Another one we asked about was unified communication services, which also has a fairly consistent and flat, about 30% use case for the next 5 years. So the key takeaway here really is that end customers are looking for their service providers, especially around applications, to deliver additional surround services to the software vendor supplied software as a service offerings. So backup and disaster recovery for Office 365. If we then move to how they expect to buy this, and this is something we see in the market all the time. So we asked, how do you expect to procure these services from your service provider? So number 1 and 2 here, very interestingly, we thought, were based on fixed term contracts. So pay for what you use is still the most popular, but there is some acceptance from end customers that fixed term contracts give them what they need and also enable them to get the price point they need. Fixed price per seat is still very popular, pay for what you use, no contract, which we really hear from the market as the be all and end all, and sort of driven by that credit card swipe public cloud model, isn't actually as popular as the fixed term contracts when they procure from service providers particularly. So the fixed term models are accepted. Fixed price, no contract, less so still. So there is some acceptance here, which we thought was interesting. But also this level of flexibility, so the pay-as-you-use flexibility, is appreciated and is accepted to come at a cost. On average here, it was 7.14% additional they would be prepared to pay for this kind of contract flexibility. But again, interestingly, that's much higher for the smaller organizations who really value this contract flexibility and are willing to pay 9% more for it. Larger organizations is more around the 6%. We didn't see too much difference between the 100 and 1,000 plus, only a couple of percent. So let's now look at local service provider clouds versus hyperscale clouds. And this really can be summarized by this slide. So here we asked, what would make you work with a local service provider for their cloud offering? And why would you work with a hyperscale cloud offering? These are the top three from both. And you can see we actually had the same answer set for both of these questions, and completely different things came out. So I think there's a very clear conclusion to be made from this, and it's end customers work with local service providers cloud offerings based on expertise, flexibility, and knowledge. So knowledge of how that business works is critical. Flexibility offered in terms of commercial or service-based is key. And we hear all the time that especially the smaller organizations trying to negotiate contracts and flexibility with hyperscalers is very difficult, if not impossible. So this is really valued. And bespoke solutions. This comes back to the consultancy and the advisory piece of how you tailor your offerings to suit your specific end customers. On the other side, though, hyperscale cloud offerings comes down to really, I think this is best summarized as peace of mind. So reputation, lower perceived chance of downtime, and greater perceived security. So where the customer has in need for a safe bet, they're looking more to hyperscale cloud services. And I think it's very important to understand these two things so you can understand your customers' drivers to move to the cloud, and you can position the right service for them. So we come back to the service integration point. Sometimes your offerings will be the best. Sometimes sometimes offerings from the hyperscalers which you manage on their behalf will be the best. And there's a clear shift here, depending on what the end customers are looking for, that you can take the right offering to them and win the business. We also then dug in, and I'll cover this briefly, this is in the report, of ways to differentiate your cloud service as a service provider. So there's 4 things in here and then one other slide. So offering the best of both. So 74% of end customers were willing to consume hyperscale consistent services from your own private data center. So here we're looking at offerings like Microsoft Azure Stack as a way that you can deliver hyperscale services and your own services, but have it in a private environment. So for those customers who are looking for Azure ready capability, but in a private environment, Azure Stack could be a very good offering for you to have. Almost 8 out of 10 were more likely to choose a service provider who has vendor accreditations to service and maintain the platform they're using. So this is you being able to say to your customers that your people can manage and maintain that infrastructure. Potentially you can offer better SLAs because you're holding parts. If you're putting equipment on customer site, you can say that your engineers are accredited to service that equipment on the vendor's behalf. This seems to be quite interesting. Self-service is also very interesting. So 85% of end customers like to be able to provision services from their service provider instantly via an app store. So this is, I guess, giving that hyperscale click credit card type approach, but for your own offerings. And 73%, so slightly less, but would like their business users to also be able to do that. I imagine that's IT wanting to keep a handle on it somewhat. And then agility and speed. So 8 out of 10 again say speed of deployment of the services, including private environments, is critical when they choose their partners. So as a service provider or a transitioning partner, having the right models in place where you can quickly onboard customers, even if it's on private infrastructure, is critical. And then finally, cutting out cost. And we sort of followed this up with some questions on the hypervisors. So for those of you who have cloud offerings now or infrastructure-based offerings, it's interesting when we discuss this. Some use the hypervisor as a kind of badge of honor to say, you know, we've done this with Microsoft or VMware, and therefore it's a very high standard. And some potentially look to cut cost here and use free or open source hypervisors, for example, OpenStack or Nutanix, which we referenced in here. The thing that we sort of learned from this question, and we had a follow-up, was that 6 out of 10 end customers aren't that fussed about hypervisor choice. So some are. 4 out of 10 is still relatively significant. But if you're looking to provide a cloud service which enables you to have a lower cost, then potentially thinking about OpenStack if you have the skills, or if not, Nutanix as an idea to cut out some license costs from your environments and then offer a more competitive price in the marketplace. Something to consider. And then finally, for the research, we'll take a look at the future channel partner landscape. So we had this up at the beginning. So at the moment, service provider partners do outnumber reseller partners in terms of number of partners that an organization is working with, which is potentially interesting in itself. Slightly concerning if you're in the reselling business today is that we asked if your organization has hardware requirements, are you more likely to procure via your reseller partners or your service provider partners? Service providers, it's very close, but service providers tipping this just a little, and I would imagine that's likely down to managed service contracts that they have, and providing additional hardware as part of those contracts is sometimes makes more sense than just procuring. So that this is something to consider if you're in this model today. But the good news, if you're a reseller, a transitioning reseller today, is we asked if you are using a reseller or value-added reseller today, would you be likely to consider them if they offered managed services as well as reselling their products? And almost 9 in 10 said yes. Some are already doing it. A large proportion would be very or quite likely to if their reselling partners evolved in this space. I think this comes back to the theme as we go through in terms of the regional and the local providers is knowledge of the business, trust, and flexibility. As a value-added reseller, you probably already have this with your customers. You probably already act as that kind of hardware advisor. So taking that to the next level and moving into the services side feels like a natural evolution, and end customers are more than willing to support you if that's the transition you look to make. So they're the findings. I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so now just to conclude what we think, and then give you some recommendations, and then how we think as Fujitsu we can help you act on this. So first of all, there is a lot of market opportunity here. I think we've seen that as we go through. There's a few things: strong market in 5 years, higher than the public cloud, opportunity to be even more strategic to your customers as this hybrid model grows even further. And when we say hybrid, it's not just cloud and on-prem, it's all different types of specialist service provider in the background that you can help them understand and integrate. And you have a unique position versus global organizations. I think that's been clear as we go through. There's also a lot of competition. So, you know, we talk about all these different types of organization who are providing some kind of managed services. Some of them are familiar: managed service providers, cloud service providers, these born in the cloud providers who just provide managed services on hyperscale environments, transitioning resellers, hybrid VARs. You've also then got new competition to contend with, like software vendors moving to more software as a service models, even marketing consultancies who are adding more and more technology consulting and sort of infrastructure offerings into their space as well. So there's a lot. But what we think is, to be successful in this environment, coming back to our initial few slides, you need to firstly decide what you do and what you specialize in, and then create this ecosystem of micro alliances and with committed technology partners, which is really key to differentiate, to enable you to become a service integrator. And what that will enable you to do is front end all of this stuff in the box, have partners you work with across this spectrum, which enable you to then get a sense of what your customer wants to deliver, go back, work with the partners you have, and deliver that to them. And it's clear to us as a business as well as the market that no one service provider can do everything. There's just too much now. So additional partnerships is critical, and we call these micro alliances. And what we mean by that is they're fairly lightweight. You shouldn't be afraid of competition. Occasionally you will be in the same sort of spaces as some of your micro alliance partners, but this should be accepted. It doesn't need to be as rigorous as more strategic alliances. But having this in the background to enable you to compete, we think is critical. And then to finish off, just wanted to cover 3 ways that we think we can help you with this. So first of all, we're building this ecosystem as Fujitsu. Across our current channel partner base, as well as our new service provider partners, as well as across our European businesses and our services business. So there's 3 examples here of how we're building this ecosystem. So first of all, for you to use. So we announced at Fujitsu Forum last week a European-wide alliance with NTT, who are a global provider of data centers and services, enabling you as our partners to take our infrastructure, host it at an NTT data center anywhere in Europe, and take that from us as an OpEx type model. So you don't have to procure your infrastructure via capital purchase. You can take it as an OpEx model, utilizing this new alliance. Also for us to use. So a lot of you on the call will know Fujitsu has a services business in the UK and across EMEA, and we do the same thing. So if you see the comments we make in the press very recently, we look to partners to augment our offerings as well and what we do. And there's a number of partners across our service provider ecosystem that work with our business to deliver their expertise into our customers as well. So there's this side, and there's also for you to input into this ecosystem. So what can you offer that our other partners can take from you? And at the research launch event we had a few weeks ago, we saw this in action. We have some specialist partners who work with our other partners to help them deliver more constructed offerings out to their customers, leveraging the expertise that they have. Secondly is the solutions we have. So I always split these solutions into 3. So we have our products. One we've mentioned briefly, we see a lot of traction within the service provider market is Nutanix, for the reason of being able to scale easily by the sort of node-based upgrade system, and also the AHV hypervisor, and enabling you to cut some cost in your offerings. We have a lot of providers evaluating Nutanix right now. We also have an offering called Enflex, which is a converged system. It comes out of the factory, ready to go, server, storage, networking, and enables you to get online very, very quickly. So in environments where you need a private infrastructure for a client online very quickly, this type of model could be very good. If you're putting infrastructure on your client sites and you need something that's consistent and manageable, this kind of approach can work very well. We can also help install and do a lot of surround services to these should you want to sort of move up through the stack and leave the infrastructure to someone else. And then finally, one of our standout products is the Eternus AF250, best price performance storage on the market today. So if you're offering storage services out, the best price performance means you can either offer a lower price to your customers and be more competitive, or you can make more margin. Simple as that. 2 software products I'll mention, Fujitsu Enterprise Services Catalog Manager, or ESCM. The first webinar we did in this series, we actually focused on ESCM, so that is recorded and available. What ESCM enables you to do is front-end these services to your end customers. So it gives you an app store-like experience that you can put your offerings into, and your customers get that one-click self-service feel that they do with a hyperscaler. So it enables partners to kind of really compete on a level that it would be very difficult for them to build something themselves that enables that. So it's a very exciting product. And then we also have our infrastructure manager software, which enables you to manage and maintain server, storage, networking, Fujitsu and third-party devices from one single pane of glass. So reducing the maintenance costs that you have in running your infrastructure offerings. Now, this is new as well. So that's something else that we think is very, very relevant to service providers. And then finally, on the services side, our virtual desktop as a service offering is a Fujitsu supplied service. So as a partner, you take this as a per seat or as an operating cost. There's no risk for you. You can sell seats within our DaaS service. And we've seen there's a lot of growth in this area. So if that's something you're looking to get into, but you don't want to have to manage and maintain the infrastructure stack yourself, this is maybe something we can help you with. Take a ready-to-go service out to your customers. And then thirdly and finally is the commercial models we have around this which enable you to grow and limit your risk. So there's two key ones, and we talked about these at Fujitsu Forum last week. The ability to return hardware to us in the event of a downturn. So this is, if you take hardware from us on a 3-year contract, having some flexibility within that contract. So after 2 years, if you've, say, hopefully it doesn't happen, but if you lose a big customer or you want to move to a new technology or the market's changed, we will enable you to return some equipment to us and reduce your payments accordingly. And then secondly is a buffer model to hold locally or on site with burst pay-as-you-go capabilities, additional capacity so you can facilitate this rapid growth for your customers. So that's the research results, the conclusions, the recommendations. If you're on this, you will receive the research asset next week. I imagine it'll be very early next week. If there's anything urgent in the meantime, or if you want to dig into any of these research results in the interim, please get in contact. You can find me here. This is my email address. Also on LinkedIn. Just pop my name into LinkedIn and connect, and then we can help you with whatever you've got. Okay, I think with that, we can open up for some questions. If anyone's got questions, if there's any questions in the chat, we can handle those also. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Okay, doesn't look like there is any questions. So as I say, if you do have any other questions, please just get in contact with me directly. But otherwise, I think we'll close the call there. And thanks very much for listening. And see you again on the next one. Thanks.